It was a perfect afternoon in Willowdale Park. The sun bathed the open fields in warm light as families spread out on picnic blankets. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, and dog owners strolled along shaded paths. On a weathered bench near the center of the park sat Greg Hayes, a man in his mid-40s, calmly flipping through the pages of a tattered paperback. His red "Make America Great Again" hat rested squarely on his head, standing out against the tranquil scenery. Not far away, Melissa Bennett stood with her golden retriever. At 35, Melissa was known for her outspoken opinions and fierce dedication to what she believed were the values of her tight-knit community. She prided herself on creating an inclusive environment in Willowdale and saw herself as a protector of its harmony. But when her eyes landed on Greg and his hat, her serene afternoon turned sour. To Melissa, the hat wasn't just fabric and stitching. It was a bold, offensive symbol that challenged everything she believed in. She muttered under her breath, her frustration simmering as she watched Greg's calm indifference. Unable to shake her irritation, Melissa decided to take action. Gathering her resolve, she marched toward Greg, her dog trailing behind. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the hum of the park. Greg looked up, meeting her fiery gaze with a polite but curious expression. "People like you don't belong here," she snapped, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Greg raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but firm. "I'm just sitting here, reading my book," he said, closing the paperback slightly but keeping a finger between the pages. His lack of aggression only fueled Melissa's irritation. She pointed at his hat, her voice rising. "That hat represents everything that's wrong with this country. It's offensive, and you're making people uncomfortable." Greg sighed, glancing around the park as if to confirm that no one else seemed particularly disturbed. "I'm not here to bother anyone," he replied. "I'm just enjoying the day like everyone else." But Melissa wasn't ready to let it go. She had expected confrontation, anger, perhaps an argument that would justify her feelings of indignation. Instead, Greg's calm demeanor felt dismissive, as if he were mocking her concerns without saying a word. Her frustration boiled over. "Enough of this," she muttered under her breath as she pulled out her phone. With exaggerated movements, she dialed 911, ensuring the nearby crowd could see her. Her voice was loud and urgent. "Yes, there's a man here in Willowdale Park. He's wearing one of those hats and he's being aggressive. It's making everyone uncomfortable." Greg didn't flinch. He leaned back against the bench, his expression unreadable, and waited as Melissa continued her call. Onlookers had begun to gather, their curiosity piqued by the escalating tension. Some recorded the scene on their phones, while others exchanged whispers. A few shook their heads in disbelief, but Melissa noticed others nodding in agreement, bolstering her resolve. Minutes later, the sound of distant sirens cut through the park's peaceful ambiance. Melissa stood with her arms crossed, satisfaction creeping into her expression. Greg, on the other hand, remained seated, his face calm and composed as the tension in the park thickened. A patrol car pulled up to the park entrance, and two uniformed officers stepped out. They walked toward the scene, their presence commanding attention. Melissa hurried to meet them, her words tumbling out as she recounted her version of events. "Officers, thank you for coming," she said, pointing at Greg. "That man over there is making everyone here uncomfortable. He's been aggressive and is clearly trying to provoke us." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. The taller of the two, Officer Daniels, approached Greg while his partner, Officer Rivera, stayed back to listen to Melissa. "Sir," Daniels began, "we received a call about a disturbance. Would you mind explaining what's going on?" Greg closed his book and rested it on his lap. "Of course, officer," he said. "I've just been sitting here reading my book. This woman approached me, upset about my hat, and demanded I leave the park. I haven't said or done anything to provoke anyone." Daniels nodded, his expression neutral, before turning to the crowd. "Has anyone here witnessed threatening or aggressive behavior?" he asked. The murmurs grew louder, but no one stepped forward to corroborate Melissa's claims. The officers looked at each other, their skepticism growing. "Ma'am," Rivera said, addressing Melissa, "we need specific examples of threatening behavior. Wearing a hat, even one some might find controversial, isn't a crime." Melissa faltered, her face flushing as she realized the officers were questioning her narrative. "But the hat, it's a symbol of hate," she stammered, her voice losing its earlier conviction. Daniels raised a hand to stop her. "Unless this gentleman has made any threats or acted aggressively, he's within his rights to be here." The crowd's murmurs turned into quiet chuckles, and Melissa felt her confidence crumbling. But just as she was about to argue further, Rivera's radio crackled to life. She listened closely, her expression shifting subtly, before leaning toward Daniels to whisper something. His eyes widened slightly as he glanced at Greg. Turning back to Greg, Rivera addressed him with a newfound deference. "Mr. Hayes, or should I say, Attorney Hayes," she said, her tone carrying a hint of respect. "Is there anything you'd like us to do here?" The crowd fell silent, and Melissa froze. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. Greg Hayes wasn't just a man in a controversial hat. He was Greg Hayes, a renowned civil rights attorney known for defending freedom of expression. The man she had accused of aggression was a legal powerhouse, someone who had spent his career advocating for justice and fairness. Greg stood, brushing off his pants, and looked directly at Melissa. His expression was calm, but his voice carried a quiet authority. "No, officers. I think everything's been handled appropriately. Thank you for your professionalism." He turned to the crowd, his gaze steady. "Let this be a reminder," he said, his voice clear and measured. "Judging someone by their appearance or a piece of clothing never leads to anything good. We all have the right to be here and to be treated with respect." As Greg walked away, the crowd parted to let him pass, their expressions a mix of awe and discomfort. Melissa stood rooted to the spot, her face pale, her earlier self-righteousness replaced by the crushing weight of humiliation. The officers returned to their car, leaving Melissa alone to face the judgment of the crowd and the glaring reality of her actions. Melissa stood frozen in place as the reality of what had just unfolded hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. The vibrant park, once filled with laughter and light, now felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. Her humiliation was palpable, her chest tight with a mixture of shock and anger. Anger not at Greg, but at herself for how completely she had misjudged the situation. The crowd's murmurs had turned into open whispers and chuckles. She could hear snatches of their conversations, their disbelief thinly veiled. "Did she really just do that?" one voice said. Another added, "That's Greg Hayes." She had no idea who she was dealing with. A young woman holding up her phone muttered to her friend, "This is going to blow up online. She's done." Melissa's gaze flicked back to Greg. He had paused a few feet away, his calm, deliberate movements as he retrieved his book, giving him an air of complete control over the situation. He glanced at her one last time, his face unreadable, neither angry nor triumphant. It was the look of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. That made it worse. She opened her mouth, grasping for words, for some kind of defense, but nothing came out. Her throat felt dry, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite organize. Should she apologize? Would that even matter? Or would it only make her humiliation more public? But as she struggled to find footing in the sinking sand of her pride, Greg walked away, leaving her standing there alone. The crowd slowly began to disperse, the energy shifting from intense curiosity to secondhand embarrassment. Some people lingered, still recording, while others whispered as they walked away. Melissa felt each glance like a dagger, her cheeks flushed hot with shame. Her dog, oblivious to the social fallout, sat quietly by her side, wagging its tail as if nothing had happened. The officers remained for a moment longer, watching the crowd dissipate. Officer Daniels glanced back at Melissa, his face betraying a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. "Ma'am," he said finally, his tone more measured now, "I hope this has been a lesson for everyone here. Jumping to conclusions and involving the police in non-issues only wastes resources and creates unnecessary conflict." Melissa wanted to reply but couldn't. Her voice was stuck somewhere between her pride and her humiliation. Daniels nodded to his partner, and the two turned, walking back to their patrol car. Melissa watched as they drove off, their presence, and the thin veil of authority she'd leaned on, fading into the distance. As the last of the crowd wandered off, Melissa finally sank onto the bench, her legs too weak to keep her standing. The weight of what she had done bore down on her, heavy and suffocating. She buried her face in her hands, trying to block out the world, but the echoes of the crowd's judgment remained, louder in her mind than they ever were in reality. Her dog nudged her leg gently, and for a brief moment, she found solace in its quiet companionship. She rubbed its head absent-mindedly, her mind replaying every moment of the confrontation. Every word she had said, every accusation she had hurled, every assumption she had made, they all crashed back into her, each one more painful than the last. She couldn't escape the image of Greg's calm expression, his quiet authority, his ability to turn the entire situation around without ever raising his voice. The thought of him standing there, not just unbothered, but commanding respect in a way she hadn't understood until it was far too late, gnawed at her. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to prove her wrong. He had let her bury herself in her own assumptions, and when the truth came out, it had been devastating. Melissa exhaled shakily, lowering her hands. She glanced around the now quiet park, her humiliation slowly giving way to something deeper, a gnawing realization that this wasn't just a public failure. This was a reflection of who she was and how far she had let her emotions dictate her actions. And as much as she wanted to retreat, to vanish into thin air, she couldn't. Not yet. She stood, dusting herself off as if it could somehow clean away the weight of the moment. Her dog stood too, tail wagging, ready to follow her wherever she went. But Melissa didn't leave right away. Instead, she turned and looked at the bench where Greg had been sitting. His book was gone, his calm presence replaced by the haunting emptiness of her own actions. Melissa stood there, staring at the empty bench where Greg had sat, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted. The vibrant colors of the park, bright reds, greens, and blues, blurred in her vision as her thoughts churned. She wanted to rewind time, to take back every word, every pointed accusation, every assumption. But the weight of her actions hung heavy in the air, unmovable and undeniable. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the leash of her golden retriever, grounding herself in its steady presence. Around her, the park was returning to normal. Families resumed their picnics, children chased each other around the playground, and strollers rolled leisurely down the paths. Yet, Melissa felt as if all eyes were still on her, even when no one seemed to be looking. She shifted awkwardly on her feet, the bench calling to her like a witness to her folly. Taking a hesitant step forward, she sank onto it, feeling its cool surface against her palms. Her dog, sensing her turmoil, rested its head on her knee, offering a silent comfort. Her mind replayed Greg's parting words, over and over, each time cutting deeper. Judging someone by their appearance or a piece of clothing never leads to anything good. He had said it so simply, so calmly, yet it had carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Melissa closed her eyes, gripping the leash tighter as if it could somehow stop the flood of thoughts crashing over her. Her pride wrestled with her guilt. She had felt so sure, so righteous in her indignation when she first saw Greg's hat. To her, it wasn't just a hat, it was a declaration, a provocation. But now, sitting there in the silence left in his wake, she realized that she had been the provocateur. Her voice, her accusations, her assumptions, they had filled the park with tension that had never been there before. and Greg had responded with nothing but patience and composure. That realization stung the most. She opened her eyes and glanced at the pathway where Greg had walked away, his steady stride unbroken by her outburst. The memory of his calm presence was unbearable, not because he had humiliated her, but because he hadn't. He hadn't needed to. The truth of her actions had done the work for him. The whispers of the crowd still lingered in her ears, and she winced as if trying to block them out. She glanced at the few remaining onlookers who were now casually dispersing, their attention fading like the ripples of a stone thrown into water. But Melissa knew that the stone itself hadn't disappeared. It lay at the bottom, heavy and unyielding, just like her regret. Her dog stirred, breaking her trance. Its soft brown eyes looked up at her, filled with an innocence she envied. She sighed and rubbed its head, the simple act giving her a moment of clarity. She couldn't sit here forever, trapped in her thoughts and shame. She had to do something, even if she didn't know what. Melissa stood, the movement shaky but deliberate. She didn't know if Greg was still nearby, if he had stayed in the park or walked away completely. But her feet moved anyway, following the path he had taken. The leash tightened slightly as her dog trotted beside her, tail wagging. The park stretched out ahead of her, its winding paths lined with trees swaying gently in the breeze. She felt the weight of the crowd's earlier stares on her back, imagined their eyes following her even now. But she didn't stop. As she walked, her heart pounded. What would she even say if she found him? What words could possibly undo what she had done? Her steps faltered for a moment, doubt gripping her like a vice. Maybe she should just go home, retreat into the safety of her walls, and let time bury this moment. But then she remembered Greg's calm smile, his deliberate choice to stay seated, his quiet dignity in the face of her anger. He hadn't retreated, he hadn't lashed out, and if he could face that moment with such grace, couldn't she at least try? The thought gave her just enough courage to keep walking. Melissa's steps slowed as the winding path curved around a grove of trees. The shade cooled her flushed face, but her thoughts still burned hot with the weight of everything that had happened. She caught sight of the edge of the park's pond glimmering in the sunlight ahead, its still surface broken only by the occasional ripple of ducks gliding across. She had no idea if Greg would be there, or even if she wanted to find him. Her feet, however, didn't seem to care. They carried her forward, one hesitant step at a time. Her golden retriever, oblivious to her inner turmoil, tugged at the leash slightly, curious about a squirrel darting into a nearby bush. Melissa gave the leash a gentle pull, keeping her dog close as she scanned the small clearing ahead. A few people lingered near the pond, children tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks, while parents chatted softly from nearby benches. For a moment, Melissa felt a pang of relief. Greg wasn't among them. She exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. Maybe it was better this way. She could leave now, slip out of the park unnoticed and deal with her humiliation in private. But as she turned slightly, preparing to walk in the opposite direction, her eyes caught movement farther down the path. There he was, Greg, leaning casually against the railing that bordered the pond. His book was in his hand, open, though his gaze seemed to rest more on the water than the words on the page. Melissa froze. Her pulse quickened, and her grip on the leash tightened until her knuckles turned white. Every rational part of her screamed to walk away, to let it go. But something deeper, a gnawing need for closure, kept her rooted to the spot. Her dog tugged lightly, urging her forward, and she let out a shaky breath, forcing her legs to move. The distance between them shrank slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she approached, Greg didn't immediately look up. His focus remained on the pond, his posture relaxed and composed. When she was just a few feet away, however, his gaze shifted, and his eyes met hers. For a moment, Melissa faltered, unsure of what to say. Greg didn't speak either, though his expression was calm, expectant. He closed his book slowly, tucking it under his arm, and turned to face her fully. There was no trace of malice or smugness in his demeanor, just quiet patience. That only made it harder. Melissa started, her voice barely audible. She cleared her throat and tried again, her words tumbling out awkwardly. I'm sorry. For everything. Greg said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. His silence was unbearable, and Melissa felt compelled to fill it, her words spilling out in a rush. I shouldn't have. I didn't think. I saw the hat, and I let it get to me. I made assumptions, and I acted out of anger. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to anyone else in the park. I'm just really sorry. Greg studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded. Thank you for saying that, he said, his voice as calm as it had been during their earlier encounter. It's not easy to admit when we've made mistakes. Melissa's chest tightened at the simplicity of his response. She had expected more, anger, disappointment, or even dismissal. But there was none of that, just those measured words that carried more weight than she could have imagined. She hesitated, her eyes darting briefly to the book under his arm. I don't know how to make up for what I did, she admitted, her voice softer now. But I want to try. I don't want to be that person. Greg's gaze softened slightly, and he gestured toward the bench nearby. Walk with me? He offered. Melissa blinked, surprised by the invitation, but nodded. They moved toward the bench together, her dog trotting obediently beside her. As they sat down, the park seemed to quiet around them, the distant hum of activity fading into the background. You know, Greg began after a moment, it's not about the hat. It never is. People bring their own stories, their own fears, and their own assumptions into every interaction. I've seen it happen time and time again, sometimes in court, sometimes just in life. The real question is whether we're willing to confront those assumptions when they're wrong. Melissa nodded, her gaze fixed on her lap. I've spent so much time thinking I was standing up for what's right, she said quietly. But today, I don't know. I think I lost sight of what that actually means. Greg tilted his head slightly, considering her words. It's easy to lose sight, he said, but recognizing it is the first step toward doing better. And from what I can tell, you're already trying. Melissa looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of judgment. Instead, she found only understanding. It wasn't absolution. She knew she had a long way to go before she could truly make amends. But it was something, a starting point. The two sat in silence for a moment, the soft rustle of leaves filling the space between them. Melissa felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly, though the weight of her actions still lingered. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, she felt like she could face it. Greg opened his book again, glancing down at the page before looking back up at her. You know, he said with a faint smile, it's a pretty good read. Might give you a new perspective. Melissa let out a small, nervous laugh, the tension in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. Maybe I'll check it out, she said, her voice lighter now. For the first time that day, the corners of her lips lifted into a faint, hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Melissa sat beside Greg on the bench, the sounds of the park fading into a distant hum as she turned his words over in her mind. The weight of the moment lingered, but something in Greg's calm, steady demeanor softened the sharp edges of her guilt. She shifted slightly, her hands fidgeting with the leash as her dog rested its head on her foot. The quiet between them wasn't oppressive, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. It carried the tension of unfinished thoughts, unspoken truths. Greg glanced at her, his book still open on his lap, but his attention entirely on her. You know, he said gently, moments like these can define us, but they don't have to limit us. What you do next matters more than what happened back there. Melissa's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but the memory of the crowd's stares, the judgment in their eyes, felt like a scar that wouldn't fade. "I don't know how to fix it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Greg leaned back against the bench, his gaze drifting to the pond. The water shimmered in the fading light, its surface rippling gently. "Maybe it's not about fixing it," he said. "Maybe it's about understanding why it happened. The rest will follow." Melissa nodded slowly, though the answer felt distant, elusive. She thought back to her initial reaction, the sharp surge of anger she'd felt the moment she saw his hat. It had been automatic, instinctive, as though every argument, every frustration she'd carried had found a single, convenient target. But now, sitting beside him, those feelings seemed absurd, hollow. She glanced sideways at Greg. "Why didn't you say anything back there? You could have, I don't know, argued, defended yourself." Greg's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What would that have accomplished? You were already convinced of who I was before I said a word. Anything I said would have just fueled the fire." He paused, turning to look at her. "Sometimes, it's better to let people see the truth for themselves." His words landed heavily, cutting through her defenses with quiet precision. Melissa felt her cheeks flush, her fingers tightening on the leash. "I was so sure I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was standing up for something good, but now, it just feels like I was standing on nothing." Greg tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "It's not nothing," he said. "Your intentions weren't wrong, Melissa. But intentions can only take you so far. It's the way we act on them that defines their value." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain the tangled mess of emotions swirling inside her? The anger she'd felt, the shame she felt now, the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could be better than this? Instead, she looked down at her dog, running her fingers through its fur. "I don't want to be the person people saw back there," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I don't want to be that person." Greg nodded, his gaze steady. "Then don't be. But don't let one moment define you either. What matters is what you do next." The simplicity of his words struck her, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. She glanced at him again, noticing the way he carried himself, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing who he was. It was something she didn't yet have, but for the first time, she felt like she could work toward it. "Greg," she began, her voice hesitant, "do you think people can really change? Or do we just pretend to be better?" Greg closed his book, setting it on the bench between them. "I think change is hard," he admitted. "It's uncomfortable. It forces you to look at parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But it's real if you're willing to do the work. The question is, are you?" Melissa didn't answer right away. She stared out at the pond, her mind replaying the events of the day in vivid detail. The confrontation, the crowd, the officer's skepticism, the moment she'd realized who Greg was, it all felt like a whirlwind, a collision of everything she thought she knew and everything she had yet to learn. Finally, she nodded, her grip on the leash loosening as she took a deep breath. "I want to be," she said. "I don't know how, but I want to try." Greg smiled faintly, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "That's a good place to start," he said simply. They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the day slowly lifting as the soft sounds of the park filled the space between them. Melissa didn't know what the next steps would look like, but for the first time, she felt like she could take them. The stillness between Melissa and Greg stretched, but it wasn't awkward. The quiet carried a tentative understanding, like the first threads of a fragile bridge being built. The gentle lapping of water against the pond's edge and the occasional quack of a duck filled the gaps in conversation, allowing Melissa's racing thoughts to settle. She turned slightly on the bench, her hands resting on her lap, still clutching the leash loosely. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice quiet but tinged with curiosity. "Like figuring out who you are is just a matter of choice." Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not simple," he said after a pause. "It's messy and uncomfortable, and sometimes you'll hate what you see, but it's necessary if you want to grow." Melissa let his words sink in, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to this kind of honesty, the kind that didn't feel like judgment, but also didn't let her off the hook. She glanced down at her dog, which had fallen asleep at her feet, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Stroking its fur absent-mindedly, she said, "I thought I already knew who I was. Someone who stands up for what's right. Someone who protects others." She paused, the weight of her own words catching her. "But now, I don't even know if I'm that person." Greg let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. "Maybe you are," he said. "But standing up for what's right doesn't mean acting out of anger or fear. Sometimes it means stepping back and listening, even when it's uncomfortable." Melissa's fingers stilled against her dog's fur. The memory of her confrontation with Greg, her raised voice, her accusations, it all replayed in her mind like a bad movie. She'd been so certain she was doing the right thing, but now she wasn't sure she'd even stopped to think about what right meant. "Back there," she said slowly. "I wasn't listening. Not to you, not to anyone. I was so loud." She winced at the memory, her cheeks flushing. "I think I was trying to prove something, but I don't even know what." Greg tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. "Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones trying to drown out their own doubts," he said. "What were you afraid of?" The question caught her off guard. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered that her anger might have been a shield for something deeper. She looked away, her eyes fixed on the ripples in the pond. "I don't know," she admitted finally. Maybe I was afraid of being wrong, or of what it would mean if I was." Greg nodded, his posture still relaxed but attentive. "That's a fear I see a lot," he said. "But being wrong isn't the end of the world. It's just another opportunity to learn." Melissa's eyes stung slightly, though she wasn't sure why. She blinked quickly, refusing to let the emotion show. "You make it sound so easy," she said with a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Like you've got it all figured out." Greg chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not even close," he said. "I've made my share of mistakes. More than my share, probably. But I've learned that pretending to have all the answers is a lot harder than admitting I don't." She glanced at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. There was none. His openness was disarming, and it made her feel both vulnerable and oddly safe. Melissa looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the leash. "I guess I've spent a lot of time pretending," she said quietly. "Pretending I'm sure of everything. Pretending I know how to fix things." She paused, her voice faltering. "But I don't. I really don't." Greg leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "That's okay," he said simply. "Nobody does. And the people who claim they do are usually the ones who need the most help." Melissa let out a small, shaky laugh. For the first time all day, the weight in her chest felt a little lighter. "So, what now?" she asked, looking at him. "What do you do after you've realized you've been wrong about everything?" Greg smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "You start small," he said. "You listen more. You ask questions. And when you feel the urge to judge or react, you pause. It's not about changing overnight. It's about trying to be better, little by little." She nodded, his words resonating in a way she couldn't fully explain. The path ahead still felt uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. She didn't have to fix everything right away. She just had to start. Melissa glanced at Greg's book, still resting on the bench beside him. "What are you reading anyway?" she asked, her voice lighter now, as if testing the waters of a normal conversation. Greg picked up the book, turning it so she could see the cover. It was worn and dog-eared, the title barely legible. "It's a favorite," he said. "A story about people figuring themselves out, even when it's messy." She raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Sounds fitting," she said. Greg chuckled. "It is." For a moment they sat in companionable silence, the earlier tension fading into something quieter, more introspective. The park around them seemed to breathe again, its vibrant energy undisturbed by their presence. Melissa didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure she ever would. But sitting there, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a flicker of hope. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the pond, its light filtering through the trees and dancing on the water. Melissa watched as a pair of ducks floated lazily by, their ripples widening in ever-expanding circles. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, feeling the weight of the day settle into something less jagged, more manageable. Greg flipped the book closed and set it gently on the bench between them. The title gleamed faintly in the sunlight, a quiet testament to something weathered but still meaningful. "You know," he said, his voice easy and calm, "sitting here, having this conversation, it feels like a step." Melissa tilted her head, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and self-awareness. "A step toward what?" she asked softly. Greg leaned back, his arms resting along the back of the bench. "Toward figuring out who you want to be," he said. "Moments like these, when you stop running from your mistakes and actually sit with them, they're where it starts. It's not the end of the journey, but it's the moment you decide to take it." The simplicity of his words struck her again, as they had throughout the conversation. Melissa nodded slowly, her fingers brushing over the leash in her lap. "I guess I've never really thought about it that way," she admitted. "I've always been so focused on proving something, on being right. I didn't realize how much I was missing." Greg smiled, his expression warm but measured. "The need to be right can be loud," he said. "But the truth, real understanding, that's quiet. It takes time to hear it." Melissa let those words linger, their meaning settling somewhere deep inside her. The day's events still hung over her, raw and unyielding, but she could feel the edges softening. For the first time, she could see the faint outline of a way forward. Not perfect, not immediate, but real. She looked down at her dog, which had lifted its head to sniff the air. "I don't know if I'll ever get it right," she said quietly. "But I think I'm ready to try, to listen, like you said, to stop jumping to conclusions and just be better." Greg nodded, his gaze steady. "That's all anyone can ask," he said. "And you don't have to do it all at once, just one step at a time." A comfortable silence fell between them, the kind that felt earned rather than imposed. Melissa watched the ducks glide across the water, the sunlight catching on their feathers. It was a simple scene, but in its simplicity, it held a kind of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. After a moment, she turned to Greg. "Do you think people will always see me as, the person I was back there? The one who made that mess?" Greg considered her question, his gaze thoughtful. "People remember moments," he said, "but they also notice change. If you show them who you're becoming, not just who you were, most of them will see that." "And if they don't?" she asked, her voice tinged with both vulnerability and determination. Greg smiled faintly. "Then it's their choice to hold on to the past. But you don't have to." Melissa nodded, feeling a small spark of hope ignite within her. It wasn't much, but it was something. She looked at Greg, this man who had shown her grace when she least deserved it, and felt a quiet gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice steady, "for not just walking away, for giving me a chance to, I don't know, start over." Greg picked up his book, the corners of his mouth lifting in a gentle smile. "We all deserve that chance," he said simply. "The question is whether we take it." Melissa watched as he stood, the book tucked under his arm. He looked at her one last time, his expression calm but encouraging. "Good luck, Melissa," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that made her believe those words weren't empty. "Good luck to you too, Greg," she replied, a small, tentative smile on her lips. As he walked away, Melissa stayed seated, her dog curling up again at her feet. The park seemed lighter now, the earlier tension replaced with something more serene. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she was okay with not knowing. The ducks floated by again, their ripples spreading across the pond's surface. Melissa watched them, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough.